UFP, the United Federation of Podcasts.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Franchise Fatigue. I'm your host, Brandon-Shea, and joining me is my co-host on this wonderful, wonderful adventure that we're about to partake in, Zach Moore. How are you doing, my friend?
Or am I? Yes, I am. I just ripped off a rubber mask that looks nothing like me, and now I'm back. But yes.
What if it was a rubber mask that was like of you, and then you were like you underneath?
The rubber masks do evolve over the course of this franchise. The first franchise we're talking about, don't they, Brandon?
Yes, I think they do. So, listeners, if you haven't listened to episode 0 yet, if you check out our feeds, we do have an episode 0 where we kind of talk about the show, the genesis of the show, and what we want to accomplish with the show. So be sure to check that out. There's a lot of good stuff in there. So we're not going to rehash any of that because you got to go back and listen to episode 0 because that's where we cover it all. We explain where we came from and why we're doing what we're doing. So we're just going to jump right into our episode today. So episode 1, the first franchise that we're going to be covering on Franchise Fatigue is Mission Impossible, which started in, what was it, 1996?
1996, the year that Continuity and Singh escaped Earth from the eugenic wars. Brendan, that's right.
So what you're saying is that had he not, then he would have been a star instead of Tom Cruise? Perhaps. Excellent, right on. Well, we're going to go over the next 6 episodes with you guys. We're going to be covering all the Mission Impossible films that have been released up to date. But first, we have to cover the first one. Directed by Brian DePalma.
Now,
and
are you familiar with Brian DePalma's body of work, Brandon?
I know Sisters. Sisters is a fantastic film. Have you seen Sisters?
I have not. I think this may be one of the few, if not the only, Brian DePalma film I've seen, and I got to say, I'm very impressed by his directorial style, so it's something we'll talk about as we discuss the film here.
Yeah, you definitely need to see Sisters because Margot Kidder's in it.
Margot Kidder? Well, all right, you should have told me.
Yeah, and it's amazing. It's like very Hitchcockian. I want to cover it on my Hitchcock podcast, Good Evening, at some point because it's definitely influenced by Hitchcock. But there's some really, really outstanding split-screen shots in the movie that'll just blow you away. Like it's really cool stuff. So I definitely recommend it. But first, before we get into our discussion on the film, this is one of our awesome little staples of this podcast. Zach Moore is going to give us some trivia.
Well, Mission Impossible, as most of you are probably aware, may not be, but is based on a TV show from the 60s.
What?
Named Mission Impossible, right? By Desilu Studios. It's actually a sister show of Star Trek back in the day. Leonard Nimoy appeared on it as well. So anyway, throwing that out there. But Mission Impossible, right? This is a franchise that they kind of resurrected. It had come back as a television show in the 80s, much like Star Trek, again, right? But then it became a major motion picture from Paramount Pictures in the 90s. Now, this is a hard reboot of the Mission Impossible series. It's not a sequel or anything like that. But at the time, the original plans were they were going to actually bring back Peter Graves, the original Jim Phelps, and some of the other Mission Impossible actors and team members and have them in the film, but kill them all off. And that was a major problem. Like Martin Landau, one of the most famous actors who was on Mission Impossible, he turned down the role, as did everyone else, because he was disgusted by the treatment of the original team. And I can understand why, because imagine, we're big Star Trek fans. That's why we keep referencing it here. And imagine if Star Trek ended in the 60s, right? Mm-hmm. And then in 1985, they wanted to make a movie out of Star Trek. And they said, you know what? Let's do a movie of Star Trek. Let's bring back all those guys. Let's get William Shatner and Leonard Nimoy, DeForest Kelley back. Let's have them on the Enterprise. Then let's have the Enterprise blow up at the beginning. They all die. But then Captain Kirk didn't die. William Shatner is actually the bad guy. And he's the main villain of the movie. I think, as a Star Trek fan and as a Star Trek cast member, I would have a problem with that. And that's really what happened here. And, spoilers here. We're going to talk about some spoilers in the film. Peter Graves, who played the original Jim Phelps, Mission Impossible, they wanted him to come back as Jim Phelps in this movie. But he turned it down, one, because his character died at the end of the movie. But two, much like the rest of his cast members, he was disappointed in the turn that his character took, because these are beloved characters for these actors and the fans of this TV show. And I totally understand. Like, I get why they were thinking, oh, wouldn't it be cool if we did this or that? But I'm actually very glad that they didn't go down that route. I'm glad this was like a hard reboot and it became the franchise it is. What about you, Brandon? What are your thoughts on that kind of
So what you're saying is basically if Star Trek: The Next Generation started with Star Trek Generations.
I did that did cross my mind. Like, let's bring back William Shatner and just kill him off. So
sounds like a good idea to me.
But speaking of the casting of Jon Voight, the producers cast Jon Voight as Jim Phelps because they thought the audiences would never suspect him as a villain. And I agree. He does seem pretty harmless, so it's a good way to subvert your expectations. There are some other actors in consideration for Jim Phelps, though, were Robert Redford, Al Pacino, and Robert De Niro. Now, those two guys, Pacino and De Niro, I couldn't have seen that at all, but I think Robert Redford really could have pulled off the role that's called for in this movie, just based off his Captain America Winter Soldier performance. It'd be a very similar role, so that would have been interesting to see. But I like Jon Voight in this role. It is effective in how you don't suspect him as the villain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. I didn't know that. I've never seen the TV show, right? Like, ever.
I haven't either. Show. I have zero attachment to anything before this, right?
So I know nothing about it. So I was watching the bonus features the other day when I rewatched this, and that's when I found out that Jim Phelps was a character from the TV show, and I'm like, oh, cool. So, yeah, I don't know that I would have considered this just a hard reboot. Once I found that out, I would have been like, well, this is just a late sequel. Like, he's got new people underneath him, and that's how I would have interpreted it, so...
Speaking of Jim Phelps, there was supposed to be a love triangle between Jim Phelps, his wife Claire, and Ethan Hunt, and you kind of see leftovers of that in the actual final film, but that was actually cut out from the beginning. There was more to it, and actually you see clips of this in the trailer for the film, as well as in the opening credit sequence, where you see clips of like all the characters and all the things going on. You see some of that. You like see them kissing and stuff, and you never see it in the movie. And that's actually a leftover subplot. And I thought they did a pretty effective job of cutting it out. So, speaking of Ethan Hunt, Tom Cruise, who becomes the protagonist of this film and the entire franchise, he in the scene with the CD trick, right, where him and Jean Reno are arguing about who really has the disc. That is not a special effect. That is just a practical sleight of hand trick that he does with the disc, which I thought was very funny. You think in today, like if they made that in 2016 instead of 1996, they probably would have CGI'd it or something like that. But I like how that's so Tom Cruise, right? To like learn a trick like that and put it in the movie. So it's a practical effect. So I found that very refreshing.
So was that his only stunt in the movie then?
No, Tom Cruise, he famously does a lot of his own stunts. Like in the scene where he explodes the first time he uses the red light, green light on the aquarium, right? That's him running, right? And that's really the first like big Tom Cruise run of the franchise, because he's running through the streets. Because if he had not performed properly, like he could have drowned. Because that's a lot of water coming at you. So it's Tom Cruise, and that's something I love about these franchises. Tom Cruise doing his thing, right? You respect the guy because you know he's out there actually doing the stunts, or most of them, as many as he can, that you see Ethan Hunt do. So that's just a great thing about Tom Cruise.
Now, I don't think he could have drowned, like, because, it's in a street. Like, the water would, like, flatten out pretty darn quick. Like, it may have injured him, absolutely, right? It could have pushed him, and, like, with the blunt force of the wave would have, like, knocked him down, and maybe he could have hit his head or something like that, but it wouldn't have drowned him.
Hey, man, I'm just saying, this is what the trivia says. And speaking of hitting his head, in the iconic scene in Langley where Ethan drops through the ceiling of the vault, he kept hitting his head on the floor. Tom Cruise did, until he thought of the idea to put coins in his shoes for balances to help kind of balance out his body. So there you go. Tom Cruise doing his own stunts. You got to love it, right? And some of the other castings, Ving Rhames, right, as Luther, they cast him because they felt like he was the opposite of what a stereotypical hacker would look like. And I agree with that. That's great, like, against type casting for him. You wouldn't expect him to be a computer genius. And
I just picture him in Pulp Fiction. That's all I know.
Seriously, I think most people these days, like, they only know him from Mission Impossible. But and he's still with the franchise, so good on him. But also, Vanessa Redgrave's character of Max was actually originally written for a man. So they left it ambiguous enough in the script itself, much like in the movie where they're calling Max he, and it's a bit like revelation. Oh, she's a woman, Maxine, So that was interesting as well. And her daughter, the character's daughter, has an appearance in a later Mission Impossible.
But we will talk about that later.
Down the road. And then finally, we're big on music scores, Brandon. There's actually a lost score by Alan Silvestri from Back to the Future fame. Mm-hmm. He wrote about 23 minutes of this music before he was taking off the film, and Danny Elfman took over. Danny Elfman, he does that a lot. takes over movies like people. That. But he recycled the material he wrote for this movie and used it in Eraser, another film that came out in 1996. And there are apparently some bootleg copies of his Mission Impossible score in circulation.
So why would they buy a bootleg when they could just buy the Eraser score?
That's a very good question. I don't know.
I have the Eraser score. I didn't know that.
Well, there you go. Next time you watch a Mission Impossible, turn down the volume, turn up your
Eraser score.
See if you think it fits. But there you go. That's our flyover of the trivia.
Ooh, excellent. Right on.
Mission Impossible.
I love it. Okay, well, let's jump into our discussion on the film. So, I like this movie a lot. I think it's really good. And, I've watched it twice recently now. So this is the third time that I've seen it, because I saw it originally when it came out on VHS, like 96 or 97, whenever that was. And then I didn't see it again until earlier this summer when I bought the 5-disc Blu-ray set to lead up to the new film. And then because Aubrey she watched 3, 4, and 5 with me, and she didn't watch 1 and 2. We were going to watch 1 and 2 together, so I watched it again with her and stuff. So, but I always remembered liking this movie, and I always remember thinking it was good. But I always heard people talking about this movie, I heard them saying like 1 and 2 aren't very good. And when I revisited it this summer, when I revisited it the other day, I'm like, this is a really good movie. I don't know what people would complain about this.
Yeah, I have not really heard people complain about the first one. They might complain it's a little slow. There's no major giant action pieces in the same way that the franchise would be known for, especially in 4, 5, and 6. But, my general consensus that I've picked up on is that people like the first one well enough, and the second one nobody likes, except for one guy. We'll have him on next time.
Except for one person.
And, then it kind of picked up again with 3. So for me, I've always really loved the first movie. I remember my mom and I rented it on VHS, back in the day. And there was actually a video game, Mission Impossible on N64.
Oh, cool.
That I played. I didn't get very far in it because it like all revolved around the big ballroom scene, like at the very beginning. And there's like a fire hydrant you use as a weapon and all that. So GoldenEye, it was not, okay, in 64's James Bond game. But so I do have fond memories of this movie. And I remember like all the twists and turns. I was like, oh my God, as kid, I'm like 10 at the time. It really did blow my mind. I really enjoyed it. And it was just a fun, enjoyable, movie. But I do understand why people, and I don't know how many diehard Mission Impossible fans are out there of the original show. Like there are, obviously now with Star Trek's a phenomenon. So you really can't, they're really apples and oranges, but they are from that same era. And that's why I made that comparison earlier. I can see why people who like love the original show would be a little cold to the movie.
Yeah. See, when I watched it on my rewatch, I really remembered nothing of the first time that I saw it, because it was 97, so that was 20 years ago was the last time I'd seen this movie, so I remembered nothing about the movie at all. But I remember when I was watching it, and when Jim Phelps' character gets shot, and you see the video of it, I'm like, that is some bad special effects, because that just looks like he shot himself, right?
Look like he just pointed a gun at the camera.
looks like he just shot himself. Like, could they not get an extra for this scene? And so it was weird, because when they revealed at the end that that's actually all that he did, I'm like, oh, okay, well, I guess at least they kept it consistent, so when you went back and did a rewatch, you'd be able to see that, yeah, he just shot himself. But, I mean, like, not remembering the movie, I caught that, and I'm like, oh. So that kind of threw me for a little bit of a loop. I don't know, what do you think?
Yeah, I think everything does add up, because I remembered certain images, really, right, pieces in the movie, but I didn't remember, like, when they all happened and what order and things like that. So everything did check out, and I really one of the most striking images of the whole movie that I remember is when Ethan's putting the pieces together, talking to Jim at the end, and we're getting the exposition and the demonstration, which this movie does a few times. So I really enjoy that kind of storytelling. You see Jim Phelps just laughing, right, as he's putting blood on himself, just laughing hysterically. I'm like, that image really stuck with me, all these years. Because he's like, I've killed my whole team. I'm getting away with murder here, right? And
I never interpreted that he was laughing.
Oh, I did. I don't know. Maybe he was yelling, right? I guess he was yelling at the time. But to me, I just thought he was having a good old time pulling over on his team. That's how I interpreted that